Hi everyone. Thanks, extra thanks for coming out tonight and canceling your plans for the beach and making your way here. It's a real pleasure to have Pelin and Keller Easterling here with us tonight. I think what we will do. I think the idea is for Pelin. Pelin will present a short paper. A short piece reflecting on some points in Keller's work and also applying things that she has gained from Keller's work to a more specific regional perspective. Yeah. Through case studies from the southeast borderlines of Turkey to the Pearl River Delta in China. Pelin and Keller will discuss how to approach infrastructure spaces and their territorial affects. Just by way of brief introduction, Keller Easterling is an architect, writer, and professor at Yale. Her most recent book, Extra Statecraft: The Power of Infrastructure Space, examines global infrastructure as a medium of polity. And Pelin is a sociologist and associate professor of contemporary architecture and art. She has taught at the Faculty of Architecture, Mardin, Artuklu University, Mardin, and at PolyU School of Design, Hong Kong, and was a research fellow at ACT, MIT School of Architecture and Urban Planning, Japan Foundation, DAAD, Hong Kong Design Trust, and CAA Kitakyushu. Please join me in giving a warm welcome to Pelin.
Thank you very much for coming again. They said New York people will not come to any event in a snowstorm. So I couldn't understand that as a person outsider from US and New York. But thank you for coming. With Keller, we have a kind of intellectual exchange for some years, and I have a lot of interest on thinking, on analyzing, on researching infrastructural space within the different scales. I titled this talk "Infrastructure as a Symptom." I don't know it's a good idea to approach infrastructure as a symptomatic entity. Maybe it's a wrong approach. This we can discuss that in our conversation or with our question, but it's a kind of it comes more up discussion about writing about what infrastructure means nowadays from urban perspective, from contemporary art perspective, from architecture, and they are not so far disciplines, but they are different disciplines, and it's mainly in urbanism. We define and base a lot of urban structure, analyzing through infrastructure, real spaces, but in different scale. For me, I need always to understand how we can approach differently in different regions. What are the methodologies of that, and how we can create understanding of infrastructural space. We used a kind of paragraph from Elisabeth Povinelli. That she opens a kind of path of thinking how infrastructure, although she doesn't speak directly about infrastructure, but how infrastructure can be can present a kind of figural tactics of neoliberalism and different kind of statecraft in different geographies, territories. I think this two-thing concept, this geontologies of Elisabeth Povinelli and I think Keller's extra statecraft, maybe they are not the same concepts. They don't have maybe the same epistemological background, but I feel that it is somehow coming together, those two lines of concept. It's very difficult with, I work a lot on the field, but then I teach also in the architecture faculty theory. And we always tend to know that two things are different, theory and field research. Especially in architectural education, but actually is not. Both are very together. But I always have a difficulty. You have feelings for some concept, and you want to talk about such concept like infrastructural space. And when you're in a territory, walking in a vast land and seeing a kind of water dam or coming across to Roman ancient old space of water, or you engage with refugee camps or something like that, like different scale of infrastructural space, you feel something about conceptual changes, but it needs time to define. I think this kind of discussion and conversation together makes more clear what we are seeing, what we are researching, and how we want to define things. This is what I want to say firstly, because I think it's very much about, as a scientist, it's all about the feeling also. We feel concept, we feel the territories, and I think it's good to feel and not really define systematically. I want to open a kind of a small-scale infrastructure. This is a corridor in a refugee camp, in a self-organized Yazidi community refugee camp, in between Mardin, where I'm teaching and staying, and city Diyarbakir. The camp doesn't exist anymore, but it was like 1.5 years hosting around between 1,500 and 2,000 people who escaped from Shanghai, and they run out by walking, and they occupied, with the help of the self-organized NGOs and municipalities, a space. And I'm not going to show about the space, but the most interesting, as we consider a self-organized refugee camp, a spaces of solidarity, a spaces of emergency infrastructure, a solidarity infrastructure, a basic a space that people build up their inhabitants with very limited condition and sources. It is interesting to see how different scale of infrastructural space plays a role in the process. This is a corridor that was built by Yazidi women who wanted to create a semi-public spaces in the camp because their husband was not allowing them to sit on the front outside in the public space. So they created their own semi-public, and I think I'm walking here, and I'm with my phone, I'm shooting the corridor because I wanted to understand how meter long is it. It connects 4 or 5 tents in a different site, and it's create a kind of corridor for not only walking, of course, but is also connecting different kind of tents, families who are related to each other. And let me go back again, maybe you can watch again. So, and the women, they built this with found material, woods and plastic and blankets generally. I find this level of infrastructural space very fascinating in understanding how those women, with what kind of aim they temporarily they built, and what we understand from an architectural perspective in the faculty, in the education, from the educational part, from the institutional part, what corridor means in architecture. So it's a kind of a different meaning with practice, I think. So I work a lot in different scale and territories, and the condition and realities are always affecting differently to understand infrastructural spaces. This is a village, one image. The village is 20 minutes by car far between the Syrian border and the city. I mean, we are just 20 minutes to the Syrian border. And this city is also Hellenistic town, ancient town, and a Roman garrison for security and surveillance. It used to be in the 100 years ago, and now it's a village for a long time. And we were working with my student on this village, and my personally a lot. It's often defined as an archaeological site, this village, and this the houses and the roads and the water infrastructure. The water infrastructure is sustaining. I mean, the design, the structure of the infrastructural space of water is sustaining for a long time. I mean, during the ancient and Roman time, the city was serving a kind of storage for water, and under the city, under this, I mean, that time was a city, but now we call it a village. Under this village, there is a lot of canals of like 15 meters deep storage of water spaces, but there is also here's the Dara. It's called Dara. And we still working on this village. I'm trying to understand how, with many layers of historical layers, infrastructural layers, how I can understand Dara. I mean, there are families and villages are living there. Some of them are living in Mardin, and there's a Kurdish city, town, village, and mostly archaeologists are claiming it as an archaeological site. But for me, it is more than archaeological site. I'm trying to understand how we can approach such kind of space, which is near to a border where the war going on, and which is a kind of mix of human climate of different kind of ethnic communities, and many ancient artifacts that is being used in building houses still. I mean, with existing structures and artifacts, people continue to build their houses, which generally the government or archaeologists, they don't want. They want to preserve the village. But I think it's a kind of a preservation for me already using the existing material. How we were approaching, we started with some classical analysis with urban and architectural approach. You check and you find the public spaces of the village, you find the institution of the village, from mosque to primary school to funeral houses and so on, and try to find also the old waterways, water canal, and the storages from the Roman time, and also contemporary structures. We call it the cosmology of Dara. And there are many layers that the infrastructural space is defined. First, it is in a war zone and is under specific condition politically. Secondly, it's an archaeological space. is claimed that is an archaeological site, and actually some of the neighborhoods and some houses are forced to leave their houses in order to preserve the village. And then it is also a mobility of people that Christian Arabs were living there, and now Kurdish community is living there, and is more Kurdish city, and so it's a kind of every 15, 60 years, every 100 years. I mean, people are coming and leaving and dwelling this village. So it has a many layers, and also it has a lot of stories of violence from the past century. This is one case. It is. I don't want to jump from one case to other case, but I have to. I think because of this time. There is. In Mardin around, I'm focusing on those. Just to summarize, there is a spaces of decay. Contemporary decay, which are refugee camps. We are surrounded with 4 or 5 official camps. And we hosted, I think the city hosted 3 self-organized camps in the last years. And this is a kind of contemporary infrastructure of how people at the same time trying to inhabit, but at the same time state is trying to create spaces, landscape, or transforming the landscape into a camp. I mean, to create a camp, you need electricity and water and other new policy to create the space. I know that one camp in north of Mardin, to flatten the land, the state had to dynamite the land in order to flatten, in order to establish a living habitat, a camp. So there are many transformation going on. But then we have the opposite, you know, the Dara village, which is a totally a kind of a past artifact, total artifact, and has a different kind of layer of infrastructure, from water and being in a border with different kind of production. I work when I was in Hong Kong School of Design for a while, and I was visiting a lot in Hong Kong and China. And maybe it's a very common issue. I think there are many people working on Pearl River Delta, around the delta. There are few cases. One is the urbanization around the delta. And then secondly is the work and labor condition, the factories that was built in the end of 90s. And it was a new work force around that. And new spaces, new parks, new landscape was built in different kind of part of the east side and the west side of the delta. And itself, it presents a kind of border zone between China and between Hong Kong. And it's an interesting place. There are many artists, many urbanists, many architects are working as a researcher and in a different way. This is a picture, the photo I took is from the oldest fishing villages in Panyu. And as you see, the bridge is coming to the village. There are many infrastructural projects from the state and government sides. There are bridges and highways. And then this is a big infrastructural project that brings many actors and many investment together. But it is also, I find it also sometimes, it's projects of infrastructure for infrastructure, like keep going the infrastructural process. And by processing, try to, this processing try to create a calibration between policy and communities and state is an interesting and complicated reality, I think. I try to focus on the fishing villages. That is a kind of an opposite structure, smaller version, and most of them are, those fishing villages have hard time to exist because the whole big infrastructure are coming, and they have to, their labor condition is changing, their spatial condition is changing, and but at the same time, if you just focus on the on its scale, you can see that they're functioning from the water side with the fishing activities. In the middle, you have the villages, and who are preparing and keeping up the process of fishing economy. And then on the back of the villages, you have banana field and other kind of farming field that the people are circulating in those three part of entities of this whole village. Kind of in a relational way. This is one village that is very active in fishing, and also the women, they're producing their own fishing nets. And behind this village, there is this kind of banana and different, I mean, there are many sites like that, kind of farming place. This is one of the photo that the woman is producing the handmade. I have a video that I'm going to show, a small clip about that. I'm still continuing with that too, trying to understand what is the future of those villages. I mean, how they can sustain, and how such kind of threshold infrastructure can teach us, how we can also help them to sustain. There's an artist and people that I collaborate. Shu Tan is one of the artists who's doing a lot of research on villages around, I mean, from Shenzhen to Panyu to Nanshan, around the whole delta. And this is kind of artistic research. Like I'm jumping a little bit from different, not different, but kind of another dimension of how infrastructural spaces has been approached. Shu is doing, I mean, our surname is same, but it's just a coincidence. I'm not Chinese, but I collaborate with Shu and his team. And Shu is interviewing villagers, and he's collaborating with. There are many artists in the villages, and there are many cooperatives in the villages, and most of them are not fishing villages. I'm more focusing on fishing villages, and there's another Chinese artist who works a lot in Macau in fishing villages that we are collaborating a lot. Actually, we all together, we're trying to bring the village research together, called Pearl River Delta Heritage Archive. So we want to archive and bring them together. And Shu is more focusing on the villages that are squeezed in under fast urbanization. This is a scaffolding pavilion. When we speak about infrastructure, and especially from artistic perspective, is always the art institution that is the infrastructure. I mean, generally. And in art, it differs what we're discussing in urban and rural and more from a geo-ontology perspective. In art is more the house that keeps hosting and creating the artistic practice. And this is a scaffolding bamboo pavilion that Shu and his friend built it. Actually, we were invited to Shenzhen Architecture Urbanism Biennial that is just going on right now. And Shu and his team, they don't want it to be inside the building, and outside of the exhibition space, with the villagers, with the cooperative and villages together, they built a scaffolding space that they can do the meetings and presentations and musics and cooking, everything together. I think this is another kind of way how we do research and then come together and then create a kind of a third space that all understanding and research can host. So you shift from one understanding of infrastructure to another one, and it's a kind of this itself, this kind of scaffolding pavilion is a kind of a dilemma itself, like not an institution, but it's a space that we want to bring or somehow institutional knowledge, although we're trying it to non-institutionalize it, but is a kind of, I think, is a main question of infrastructural space too. So this space was running, it's ending next week, but many things were discussed. I mean, we had this kind of same topic meeting too there, and also we shared our research and with the villagers and so on. Sometimes I have to cook with the villagers together. I want to just remind you some maybe if I find it before to show the clip. There are just, I don't want to be so pedagogical, but there are some writers that I follow, some researchers who discuss about infrastructural spaces. For example, Stephen Graham and Colin McPhair, they are more urbanist, and actually they produced a book years ago, in the beginning of 2000, about infrastructures as assemblage urbanism. And most of their texts are claiming that the broken infrastructure is also creates different kind of network, different kind of possibilities. And this is one side of seeing infrastructural space in urban space. And then we have Keller's approach that brings us the infrastructural space as a statecraft, and many law and infrastructural action happens together in relation. So I think it's more, her approach is more like from a hegemonic approach to looking from the state and so on. And there's another interesting writer I read a lot, he wrote a lot about delta ontologies. He is also a spatial researcher. I don't know if he's an urbanist, but he writes about delta infrastructures. How a delta, a space of delta, of water and embankment and geology and movements, flow of life and non-life element brings the new meaning of the delta itself. This is how I'm trying to approach parallel deltas too. I think my aim is more, although I call it as a symptom, I mean, we can discuss that. I don't want to see only infrastructural space as a physical entity that we see and we should guess what is behind it. I prefer that infrastructure in many scales, from a corridor to a village, to a neighborhood, to a scaffolding, bamboo scaffolding pavilion, to a delta, brings me the question, what infrastructural scale conveys, and during the process, what kind of new information and knowledge and expanding network brings it into it. I'm trying to look in that way. I think in many state infrastructure, like water dam, for example, that we with one of my colleagues, we wrote a lot on that. It's also a kind of infrastructure for infrastructure, I call it. You create the structure. To creating the structure, you need other physical structure. And it's all related to each other, to instrumentalize and to feed each other. That has an effect in policy level to level of on the human life and non-human life. So, like Rotterdam, how it removes how this possesses the villages' land, and how evicts villages, and also how it destroys the ecology and animal life. So this is a kind of approach. We continue to discuss, but let me show maybe Keller. I show this clip of, and then okay, 1 second. This is a short trailer. I have a huge amount of video footage, but this is a kind of small trailer that can give an idea. Wow, so many. They're not so. I don't have the subtitle in English. But normally I was interested how they sustain the fishing families, which hour they go to the sea. What are the female role? On the right side you see is a kind of a luxury housing building. And the other side is a village.
你一般一日工作幾長時間？
自己功夫做到幾時靚仔？
幾時啊？
要做埋晒為止啦，唔係人哋俾魚你又自己攞到翻嚟又係。
你哋一般去邊度打魚啊？一般去邊度打魚啊？
漲潮啦。
漲潮。
漲潮。
但係去邊啲地方咧？
哇！你車開呢度有啦，一時。
係嘛？唔使去到好遠嘛。
車到開嗰去。
Normally we were interviewing them. These are the women who lost their pension money because the fishing cooperative in their villages is somehow ended, dismantled, and they're doing for I mean, for life, they're doing their for long years preservation of fishing and separating them and so on. And this is some. I mean, it's 20 minutes. It's a bit long, the video. So I don't think I'm going to show all of them, but. This is a couple. Actually, their son is working as a white-collar class in Guangzhou, and they still continue their business, like getting fishes for the fishmongers. And we had an interesting discussion that how, although the labor condition changes around the Pearl River Delta, I mean, the second generation, third generation goes to big cities to work in urban economy, new marketing economy. And they have nothing to do with the fishing activity and economy anymore. But they were explaining me that their son is not able to, I mean, is more in a precarious condition than them, as a white collar in one of those skyscrapers. So I try to understand, I mean, which is very near to our life condition in different maybe cities or social realities. About the level of precarity and how, if you follow from big infrastructural project, state-led, city-led infrastructural project in Pearl River Delta, and then go down to the level of the threshold, totally opposite the threshold infrastructure that are based on different kind of economy, heterogeneous economy. You see kind of a different scale how those infrastructural spaces are sustaining, how behind the spaces the labor condition is working, how female gender differences play role. I'm trying to understand in that way, and then the whole network and clash between them. I think maybe we continue with Keller, and then we can. There's a huge amount of work to show very small. I hope it makes sense to jump from one scale to another scale. Oh yeah, okay.
You should continue. I mean, don't touch her.
With this video, you think?
Or whatever you want to talk.
You want to talk about? No, actually, I'm just want to continue. If you come and. You had some, Keller. You had something?
Yeah, but maybe it's better just to have
Okay.
have conversation.
Okay. Because.
I mean, I'm not entirely sure, but I did. But I got some new insights into how you, in your work, as I've been sort of watching it, because I was going to show you all some images that I have used of Pelin's work, that is dam infrastructure in Turkey that is well, maybe I shouldn't talk about it, but
we cannot show the project.
Yeah,
we are live stream, but off. We can tell more later.
Yeah, we'll talk about it later. It's interesting because while you were saying, well, you know, what Keller kind of does is, you know, it's infrastructure with regard to statecraft. It's funny because I had also regarded this work that you had been doing on water infrastructure as related to statecraft, and then always trying to kind of put it together with other more granular research that's spatial, but almost following a kind of anthropological methodology, or a sort of social science methodology. And in today, when we kind of reflecting on what I thought I might talk about, I think that our approaches are strangely a lot closer than I had thought. your actual methodology much different, where you go, what you encounter, the kinds of evidence, very different. But I don't know if it's true, but I think one thing we might share is the fascination with the corridor, with the corridor in any scale. That I mean, it's certainly the way I regard infrastructure is not as pipes and wires under the ground, or dams, or communication, transportation, wires and things like that, but more as a kind of medium, as a kind of mixing chamber for space, and as a kind of not even necessarily a study of technologies, but a study, but as unlikely as it may seem, a kind of prompt for an adventure in thinking and an adventure in design. And I think I think design is a much trickier, frequently quite embarrassing thing to embark on with this kind of space, and yet I insist on doing it. Because there is something, it seems to me that the incredible power of some of these spaces requires another kind of artistic approach, where one isn't interested in object, but interested more in kind of chemistry or wiring of space. And that's a different kind of form making, but it is form making. And to kind of stand back and merely observe it, I can't do that anymore. The sort of reportage. I think we're all incredibly bored with the rhetorical object, and are keen to, in different ways, engage it. You, in my view, engage it in a way that requires much more bravery than I have, and I'm trying to engage it in another way.
I want to say something. I think three things comes out. One is that, yes, infrastructural space is, when we say that, is very general. It has a lot of scale, a lot of function, different kind of function. And this is why infrastructure is not always highways, tunnel, water dam, kind of a big physical structure that is meant to provide service for population. So is not, I mean, this is for sure, is we are not only focusing on that, or if we are focusing on that, we are looking at as a material assemblages that are trying to understand what those entities are trying to instrumentalize through states, through different kind of network of actors. But this structure has a hegemonical power. It has a power of violence also. This is one thing. And but if we are trying to define all the infrastructure as a statecraft, which is not possible, of course, because we have these fishing villages which are totally different scale, or this corridor, although is a medium, but is more like grassroots activities and network of infrastructure. And this gives a kind of understanding that we have a kind of knowledge, empirical knowledge, that brings that there are alternative and autonomous way of possibilities of infrastructural space. Otherwise, I mean, this physical structure is basically tools for biopolitics. We look together with biopolitical practice of state, or any kind of organizing and colonizing and the human population, or with non-life entities. So I think this is one side to look, but then this kind of methodology also gives a closure of not able to see and understand smaller or different kind of infrastructure of possibilities. That could be solidarity infrastructure. It could be interdependency, autonomous infrastructure, like this corridor itself. I think these two sides of understanding infrastructural space brings, for me, this dilemma, to look from two sides and how it is produced and functions. And one thing with rhetoric, we look into the material, yes, to empiric material, mostly as in the design, in the architecture. Although myself, I'm a designer and architecture, I like to focus and see it through Keller's approach in her book also as a medium. But I think in one sense, rhetoric is also needed because the whole infrastructure has also a kind of a past definition that comes from rhetorical discourses. So I think two things is needed to understand, to naked empirical case and how this case is functioning, the structure as a medium, and then what kind of rhetoric is surrounded and is producing. So it's two things. And then with the methodology, I think we are living in a very complex flow of knowledge and territories, which makes maybe difficult to find your methodology as an artist, as an architect, as a designer. But at the same time, it is, if you cross-cut this whole spatial ontologies, it's also very simple to understand the main structure. I mean, from one corridor to a village water cistern, and then to the fishing village's boat. I have this metaphor, which is also very artistic for me. I try to tend to follow this metaphor. And then I go back again to look through these metaphors and through this chain to hardcore issues like labor, construction, class, gender, and it needs a kind of, I think, transversal methodology that you pick up ethnographic and then you pick up a kind of engagement. For example, in Shu's project, Shu Tan's project, that is continue with collaborating with the cooperative and villagers together in a kind of a third space. This methodology there, I have to engage. I mean, there is no point interviewing people or drawing the map or something, We had few maps in the villages. We drew the maps of the water cistern, Roman, and then contemporary, and then try to understand the community there with different kind of ethnical conflict. But this is that case. But the other case with this project in the Pearl River Delta is I had to do with the villagers, I had to do video. There was no other methodology that I can grasp to that. I think it needs on your way to find with different collaboration and understand the mechanism of this empirical entity. But methodology helps also, I think, together. I don't know if I'm clear, this three thing. But I'm also careful not to see approach infrastructural space only as a statecraft, but see it also that how this medium with the statecraft creates a kind of different possibilities. There is a reference by Stephen Graham, the geographer, British geographer. He says that broken infrastructure can bring other possibilities of network. That there is an infrastructure that never is complete. The subway never works completely. The bridge is always broken. Is not they're building it, but the bridge is never really built. But then it brings a lot of kind of different underground urban networks that is surrounded with this broken and incomplete infrastructure. Sometimes, especially in most cities, we have this incomplete infrastructure that is keep going on to create a different kind of possibilities, but also from the state side, they keep incomplete in order to create more profit, more money, imply more policy. You know, this is also interesting. This incomplete infrastructure, I'm also very fascinated by that.
Yeah, I mean, I would say we're in very different ways share some, coming at or discovering it in different places, share maybe some desire to kind of tune the eye to see not only what an organization is saying, declaring, but what it's doing, and what is it that you're sort of seeing with half-closed eyes that has to do with the disposition of a space, its temperament, its degrees of violence, the discrepancy between what it's saying and what it's doing. All those things are just almost training a perception to see, but see quite practically what the potentials in an organization are. I mean, I think it's almost something like seeing a game board, or seeing. But I want to talk a little bit about. I want to ask you a little bit about whether this prompts in you any desire for the manipulation of those spaces.
Myself?
Yeah, as in design.
No. But manipulation has a different kind of. There are different kind of ways of manipulating. I think this collaboration with you and the other villages is also a kind of inserting a manipulation. It doesn't need to be designing. I mean, this temporary pavilion is a design,
Yeah.
And for an infrastructural space, we always speak about physical form. Although if it is a solidarity infrastructure or it's a temporary infrastructure, is at the end a physical space that hosts something or brings the people and network. I think in my personal case, manipulation would be in a different kind of action, but more creating alliances and togetherness, and from different perspective. It doesn't need to be design. I think this would be a little bit tautological, like trying to manipulate design against the physical structure. It can be a very tautological that would not allow any other possibilities of thinking, of manipulation. But in the architectural studio, we ask for manipulation. We ask the student to do and propose a design, and so. But I tend to think that how can we imagine different kind of manipulation, even in a discursive level, that can have a physical effect. This is.
Well, for me, sort of thinking about infrastructure, which again, in my case, while I'm trying to go to the level of global politics, it's still where the contemplation of it resides is in the corridor. It's in, what is the disposition of the space? What is the disposition of this space here? And maybe there are some designers, probably you among them, who are constantly aware of that. I mean, I keep saying that it's almost like having a kind of canine mind, where you hear words that people are saying, and they're in different languages, and sometimes you understand what they're supposed to mean. There's an assigned meaning for them, but more like a dog. You can't see those signals and declarations outside of a whole bunch of other affective cues and positions of things and positions of people next to each other and so on. So in a way, I might be wrong, I might be projecting, but to think about that wiring, to think about all those positions relative to each other, whether it's who cooked dinner or where, or all the positions of all of the particles in this medium, is itself a kind of, I mean, it's too obvious to say, of course, it's a kind of form making. It's a kind of form making. And it seems that to rehearse that a kind of form making which people who, quote unquote, design, are usually unable to do. It's kind of like they're very well rehearsed in making objects and doing a kind of violent manipulation, but very under rehearsed in population effects or small manipulations that change the chemistry. Very good at making declarations, but not very good at seeing the interactivity between things. So it's that is why, for me, infrastructure is an adventure in thinking and an adventure in design, because it's a different kind of, because it's rehearsing a different kind of form making, more canine, more like a kind of a pool player, where you don't have an answer, you don't even have an intention, you just have a reactivity to what is moving, and how to make it more information rich, or how to reduce violence within it, and that's what I might be wrong, but I am projecting or sort of seeing you as sympathetic in this way to some things that
I think the one other important thing is the event that happens that reveals the whole conflict and structure of infrastructural space. I mean, like, I remember the bus terminal in our town. It was just going to open as a bus terminal, but then the terminal, I mean, we received like 650 immigrants from the border, and they went into the terminal. I mean, it was they hosted there, they dwelled the terminal for more than 6 months or something, nearly 1 year, which was behind our faculty, that was happening in front of us. I mean, we were part of that, observing the social reality, but this whole sudden event, people going into an existing infrastructure, it has a specific design structure as a bus station, bus terminal, and then is occupied by families, and they're living there, and they're transforming the whole space into a little town. This is also very interesting that this. I don't want to fetishize any event. I'm not speaking about that, but how such kind of event brings different kind of mobility and a different way of inhabiting and movement that we can imagine infrastructure otherwise. I think there's a time issue. It could be temporary. It could be permanent. I mean, the temporariness and permanency maybe play a role, but I don't want to say that short event comes and they have an intervention and immediate manipulation, and they bring the reality and the knowledge of infrastructure in front of you. I'm not saying exactly that, but it brings a kind of different way of thinking how the infrastructure space can process. Processing, calibrating, and how in such events plays a role. I mean, another example is this scaffolding pavilion. It's a simple pavilion, but we showed our films there. We did our village meeting there. We set up the future heritage or heritage collaboration. It's alliances that come together in this hot, you know. And this is, with the physical space, it's an action of thinking on infrastructure otherwise. It's same with the corridor. That is happens maybe for 1 year only. The corridor doesn't exist anymore. I have only the video now, and but it is from different scale, and then what is really happening there, and what kind of action you intervene. It could be temporary, but I don't say that temporary. I'm not speaking about temporary intervention. I don't want to say like that. But that brings this kind of different way of functioning. The question is it a continuous effect, or is it just a temporary that we see how this infrastructure is functioning, will function, can be redefined otherwise? Or is it just we leave and disappear and we are under the... I mean, the bad scenario is under the state-led infrastructural environment, you know. But this is the dilemma. I mean, but I tend to go into this kind of action, I think.
But I mean, just one more thing. Maybe we need to open up to the larger audience. But I want to talk about maybe the power of that temporary move as having another kind of political agility, and that is one potential power of this kind of form making, that it is not is never wanted to be assertive, certainly not permanent. That there would be the stupidest thing to do is to try to have some kind of right answer with regard to how you were making space, but that instead it's much more sly, it matches the stealth of some other power politics to be able to make a kind of time-released form that changes its path, that changes when it's outmaneuvered. So the rehearsal of this kind of temporary event is not trivial, nor is it. One doesn't talk about it. Well, it's not designed because it's temporary. It is designed because it's temporary.
Yeah,
it is designed because it's temporary.
You're right.
Yeah, and that it's. But that I don't know. I think there is.
There is another, maybe continue with that last thing. We can maybe ask the audience too. The bad scenario, for example, in Per Ribble Delta Sea, the bad scenario of the specific zone, of the whole infrastructural project, the Macau Bridge, the highways, the connecting highways between the cities around the delta, will remove the fishing villages. In Shenzhen is already removed. Nasha and Panyu and some villages in Macau still exist, but half of them are under decay. They don't have economy and so on. Their children are trying to find job in Guangzhou, in Shenzhen, in Macau. And those big projects are like monsters coming and changing the environment, landscape and environment, and creating a tabula rasa and destroying. This is one bad scenario. This might be happen. We don't see the people soon anymore. Maybe in 5 years. And then there's another opposite side that I'm involved. That you can just collaborate with the different people, like Shu is an artist, and then there's cooperative, and then there's different kind of people there, and create a kind of alliances, heritage, infrastructure that you can bring something as an intervention. This is where I am in between.
And you might disagree, but in my arrogance, I also think that this same habit of mind about seeing matrix and so on is scalable. That it can potentially strike at the heart of even these larger projects. That it's not as if we're relegated simply to, but there, and maybe maybe you and I are working sort of at different ends of the same with the same habit of mind. I don't know, but I think we should ask for questions from the floor.
Yes.
Yes, I guess just a comment. I guess it's really difficult to kind of design to kind of prescribe the function over time. So that effect is bound to be determined by a kind of historical space or proximity to resources or and in space, because you can imagine like the corridor that functions as a kind of public space for a while for refugees, in a moment that it gets co-opted by, say, or either becomes taken over as a kind of hospital function, or it becomes like a police function or something like this. It changes totally meaning. And also, I guess the river in the delta, which is not a kind of human design, but it's about the kind of interpretation of a possibility of a space, I guess. I guess that's another thing I think is interesting, that infrastructure is about interpreting the possibilities of a place. So you can say the river, in as far as it can sustain some smaller fishermen, it can do that because they can see it as somewhere where they can get resources out and freight it around. And while the big ships can use it as something else, they're part of a different kind of economy, and this is the same space. So I'm just wondering if you have any thoughts on the role of kind of interpretation of the spaces. I mean, another example would be, say, the city street, the main street in the city, which in the daytime would be a kind of reflection of the kind of core allowed values in a society, what's allowed to be seen in the daytime. But given that it's known within a certain community, performing things that are not allowed in society, that same place becomes a meeting place for kind of illicit activities or something like this. And it's the same structure. It's about interpreting or using a space for different means. Yeah.
Knut, this is a question?
No, I was just wondering if you had any thoughts on the kind of role of a kind of more the role, instead of the role of the construction and the kind of formal aspect of a space, than on the kind of the active act of interpreting spaces. I mean, another example would be, I don't know, you design a big structure in the middle of a place, but it might be too open and not fit people, and then a back alley becomes more active as a result of building that one structure. So, yeah.
I mean, there are many examples of such usages, I mean, especially in any city, the migrants are using differently the public spaces, the spaces, and day and night, it differs a lot. But if you ask him specifically for the fishing villages, it has a different kind of function. It's more complicated because according to geographical condition, where the villages are in the embankment of the delta, and then how near they are to the cities and to the highways, the activities differs. I mean, I remember I had to find 2 villages through seaway, there was no highway to connect it to the village. So I had to go in another way. But they have different kind of, production of fish. Production means selling to the fishmongers, separating them, drying them, preparing in a different way, and then there is another side that they're transforming their houses into cement houses. So the space, what they have, it differs in a different condition. So it is very difficult to follow, and also the capitalist flow. The class differences, how the big cities are affecting the villages, and then the everyday life practices of those villages are transforming in a different way. And there are many potentialities, but then there's other potentialities that they are kind of negative way. That people have to leave their villages, their houses, or they get money in order to transform it into other type of houses. The housing is another issue there. So it's difficult to answer. In urban space, you can find more interpretation of spaces, but here these are see it as a little production spaces. I'm not speaking in a very harsh way, but kind of not. I'm not speaking about capitalist production space. I'm not speaking about a factory, but is a kind of a natural research dissemination spaces, and with the effect of the different cities from the big ships and so on, the relation to that, they are transforming. This is for sure, but. It is not possible to define much different interpretation of spaces there, I think.
Yes, thank you, first of all, for all the references and your talk. I wonder, I would like to refer a little bit to ontologically to the idea of the corridor, not only as a public space, but also as a space of commons, and also related not firstly to the urban space and corridors as transportation forms, but also as a space of connections and to the web and to the common territories, and then transfer it to the network and web and to the possibly to the idea of Creative Commons, and then in the idea of infrastructure and to the term of a corridor as an infrastructure, why do you comment it only as, or do you see symptom, the term of symptom ontologically as a passive ground, or do you also see it as an active ground of solution or of a proposal? To us, yeah.
One thing is corridor as a commons. In this case, is representing more spaces of commons that the women are building in order to connect, and they're spending their everyday life in these corridors in order to create, sustain the camp life. But I think we shouldn't. It's an active space in that sense, but active means also control. We shouldn't forget that the meaning of corridor is control also, controlling biopolitics, controlling the bodies. Is not only a passage of connecting spaces, and is not only spaces of commons, but active spaces of control. It has the two things, like in this example of corridor, the women are creating their own spaces. It's a kind of practice of commoning, but then they create them because of the force of their husband doesn't want them to sit outside of the total public space. So it's a kind of a gender control at the end. Yeah, it has two sides, you know. And if you go to the control of the border crossing, like if you pass from Amman to Palestine, you have to go 3 big corridors. This is really a passage. They make you wait. You have to cross, and it's all like the whole administration in the corridor. It's this type of control. So spaces of control, spaces of commons, it's always, for me, it's a kind of conflicting. Thank you that you bring this forward, because I have this dilemma always. Through experience, it can also present an active spaces of control, you know. I'm thinking more a positive, more an active space of commons, you know.
But I just, like brainstorming, I'm sorry about this, but I think in relation to also to the whole movement, the immigration movement, and all the corridors and all the rivers and all the web and the social territories that they are nowadays, I just think that maybe this is the ways, this is the paths to forget about the geographical territories and focus on these corridors, that it will have like more and more a kind of upstream of people moving from one direction to the other, and in the same, like as in physicality in the urban space, but also in the web. So, I mean, there is different ways of hacking this control.
Yeah.
So there are different ways of opposing to this control by overloading these paths. So that's why for me this symptom is not just only a symptom. It could also be a suggestion against the geographical territories.
Yes,
it could,
or as a fluid space. Yeah. I understand. Yeah. Yeah. If please ask a question, or or comment, or we can also talk. After this, we can come down there, you know, and this is Keller sitting here with our socks. We can also come down and speak more closely, you know. Okay, one more question, then we come.
Feel free to say this is just completely off topic, but I am curious about if you have thought about corridors in relation with superposition in terms of quantum computing, which is something that is happening right now and potentially going to continue to happen. And I've been curious about that in terms of spaces and how corridors relate to being in two places at once, or in no place at all.
Yeah, I didn't think so much, but firstly, is related. You know, when we speak generally about infrastructure, everything you think it comes to your mind is related. You know, but yeah, I didn't think of that. Maybe I'm thinking of some examples, more empiric examples. Yeah, it doesn't come to my mind, but. I have something, but I can tell you only personally, examples, not in live stream.